Good morning, everyone. Welcome. We'll call this hearing to order, and we'll ask Mr. Stark to read the docket.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman and other commissioners, the proceeding before the Public Service Commission of South Carolina in docket number 2018-3E concerns the annual review of base rates for fuel costs of Duke Energy Carolinas, LLC. This matter has been scheduled or rescheduled for hearing on September 18th, 2018 in the Commission's hearing room at 101 Executive Center Drive, Columbia, South Carolina, 29210. Mr. Chairman, the docket is in order.
Thank you. Now we'll take appearances from the parties. Welcome. Okay. I think we have some excused parties, so we're going to get Mr. Stark to do that.
Mr. Chairman, I understand that we have had requests to be excused from Richard Witt and Tim Rogers of the Solar Business Alliance. As well, we have a request for substitution of counsel, Ms. Stinson Woodward Ferguson for Ms. Elizabeth Ann Jones.
We're granted and good with that, right? Okay. Any preliminary matters or any opening statements that we need? We'll go with preliminary first.
Briefly, a preliminary item. Good morning, Mr. Chairman, Mr. Vice Chairman, and Commissioners. Duke Energy Carolinas, the South Carolina Energy Users Committee and ORS have entered into a stipulation regarding some of the issues which were in dispute between those three parties and which was filed with the Commission on September the 10th. ORS believes that this stipulation resolves all of the disputed issues related to fuel costs and recovery of the companies under collection over the period under review. Under the terms of the stipulation, Duke Carolinas has agreed to defer $34 million of their current fuel under recovery for a one-year period for all customer classes. If approved by the Commission, the average monthly residential bill on a rate RS will increase by 2.9% beginning in October, and the fuel factor for residential customers will increase from 1.9648 cents per kilowatt hour to 2.1094 cents per kilowatt hour. Mr. Chairman, I'd ask that the stipulation be marked and entered into evidence as the first exhibit in this case.
Okay, the stipulation will be entered as exhibit number 1.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I would like to thank the Commission for rescheduling this so quickly and also for granting ORS the ability to put our witnesses up in a panel. We'll be presenting 3 witnesses today, Mr. Anthony Brazino from the ORS Audit Department, and Mr. Matthew Schellinger and Ms. Sarah Johnson, both of the ORS Utilities, Rates, and Services Department. Thank you, sir.
Thank you. Okay, we've had, I think, request for opening remarks. Yep. Brief opening remarks is what they said.
Mr. Chairman, I don't have an opening statement to address the issues. I think Ms. Bowen is going to do that. Okay. I rise to also thank the Commission for rescheduling the hearing. It was especially important for the company. Some of these folks were very busy last week and remain busy, of course. But we especially appreciate staff working with us to find a time that would allow the hearing to be done and then be able to implement the new rates by October 1st, which is the date for that the new rates need to go into effect. So we appreciate that. We also think we have 3 panels, and we appreciate the opportunity to put our witnesses up in panels as well. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Okay. We've passed most preliminary things, so Ms. Bowen, I believe you have an opening statement.
Yes, please, Mr. Chairman. Thank you so much. And I'll echo my colleagues and appreciate the Commission being willing to reschedule this and on short notice. Again, I'm Ms. Lauren Bowen here on behalf of South Carolina Coastal Conservation League and Southern Alliance for Clean Energy. In this annual fuel cost proceeding, the company provides, among other issues, an annual update to its valuation of distributed energy resources. And the company provides this annual update pursuant to a law passed by the South Carolina General Assembly in 2014, commonly called Act 236. And they also filed these updates pursuant to a settlement agreement filed with the Commission in 2014 and approved by the Commission in 2015. And that settlement agreement sets out a framework or a methodology for calculating this annual valuation of distributed energy resources. And to date in South Carolina, that has been primarily rooftop solar. The South Carolina Coastal Conservation League and Southern Alliance for Clean Energy, the conservation groups, have weighed in on this annual valuation for several years now. In this particular proceeding today, we'll provide expert testimony from Ms. Debbie Glick about two components in this particular valuation of distributed energy resources methodology. And to set that stage, one of the things that the 2014 and 2015 settlement agreement did was allow for placeholder categories of zero values to be used for some of the components in that annual valuation until such time as those components were reasonably quantifiable. So what the conservation group's expert, Ms. Glick, will do today is provide testimony to the Commission about several of those components that have been placeholders and have been used as zero, or the company has used zero values for those. She provides testimony that we should at this time be able to reasonably quantify those values. And she then goes on to quantify those values and provide some numbers for the Commission's considerations for those particular components. And so conservation groups would respectfully appreciate the Commission's consideration of that testimony and would ask that the Commission direct the company to consider and incorporate those values going forward in their annual evaluation. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ms. Bowen. Okay, company, you can call your first panel.
In turn, and I'll start with you, Mr. Capps, since you're closer to me. Would you state your name for the record, please, sir?
My name is Stephen D. Capps.
By whom are you employed and in what capacity?
I am employed by Duke Energy Corporation as the Senior Vice President of the Nuclear Corporate Organization.
You caused to be prepared pre-file 13 pages of pre-filed testimony which has previously been submitted to this commission in this document.
Yes, sir, I have.
If I were to ask you the questions contained in your pre-filed testimony this morning, would your answers be the same?
Yes, sir, they would.
Mr. Chairman, we'd ask that Mr. Capps' pre-filed direct testimony be copied in the record as if given from the stand.
Okay, Mr. Capps' pre-filed direct testimony will be entered into the record as if given orally from the stand.
And Mr. Capps, you have 3 exhibits that are attached to your direct testimony. Is that correct, sir?
Yes, sir, I do.
And exhibits 1 and 2 are not confidential, but exhibit 3, which has information about schedule outages for nuclear plants, is confidential. Is that correct, sir?
Yes, sir, that is correct.
Mr. Chairman, we'd ask that Mr. Capps' exhibits be admitted into the record with the confidential exhibit, which is Exhibit 3 to his testimony, being filed under seal.
Okay, Mr. Capps' exhibits 1 through 3 with the confidential exhibit number 3 being filed under seal will be entered into the record as exhibit number 2.
And as part of the stipulation, we have withdrawn your rebuttal testimony. Is that right, Mr. Capps?
Yes, sir, that is correct.
Okay. Would you summarize your testimony for the commission, please?
Yes, sir, I will. The purpose of my direct testimony is to describe and discuss the performance of DEC's nuclear fleet during the review period of June 1st, 2017 through May 31st, 2018. DEC operated its nuclear stations in a reasonable and prudent manner during the review period, supplying 61% of the power generated. The 7 nuclear units operated at an actual system average capacity factor of 96.74% and a net nuclear capacity factor, excluding reasonable outage time, of 101.53%. Additionally, for the 18th consecutive year ending 2017, DEC's 7 nuclear units have achieved an actual system average capacity factor exceeding 90%. The company's nuclear fleet has a history of top quartile performance. Industry data for 2017 ranked Duke Energy's nuclear fleet favorably when compared to the 7 other large domestic nuclear fleets using key performance indicators in the areas of personal safety, radiological dose, manual and automatic shutdowns, capacity factor, force loss rate, industry performance index, and total operating cost. On a larger industry basis, using data for 2017 from the Electric Utility Cost Group, McGuire, Catawba, and Oconee all ranked in the top quartile in total operating cost among the 60 U.S. nuclear stations reporting. These performance results support DEC's continued commitment to achieving high performance without compromising safety and reliability. There were 4 refueling outages completed during the review period. Fall 2017 outages at McGuire Unit 1 and Oconee Unit 2, followed by spring 2018 outages at Catawba Unit 2 and Oconee Unit 3. All 4 refueling outages were successfully completed within the scheduled allocation. Additionally, DEC did experience 3 brief forced outages during the review period. Oconee Unit 3 in July of 2017 for 29 hours, McGuire Unit 1 in February of 2018 for 30 hours, and Oconee Unit 1 in April of 2018 for 39 hours. These units were safely and efficiently returned to service, and I believe the units were operated reasonably and prudently, and that our operations were conducted in a way that minimized our fuel costs. This concludes my direct testimony summary.
Thank you, Mr. Capps. Mr. Miller, would you state your name for the record, please, sir?
My name is Joseph Miller.
And by whom are you employed and in what capacity?
Duke Energy Business Services. I am Vice President of Central Services for Fossil Hydro.
Did you cause to be prepared pre-filed testimony consisting of 12 pages of questions and answers?
I did.
If I were to ask you the questions contained in your pre-filed testimony this morning, would your answers be the same?
Yes, they would.
Mr. Chairman, we'd ask that Mr. Miller's testimony be copied in the record as if given from the stand.
Mr. Miller's pre-filed direct testimony will be entered into the record as given orally from the stand.
Mr. Miller, would you summarize your testimony?
Yes. Good morning. The purpose of my testimony is to describe DEC's fossil hydro generation portfolio, discuss the performance of DEC's fossil hydro facilities during the review period of June 1, 2017 through May 31, 2018, provide information on significant fossil hydro outages that occurred during the review period, and discuss DEC's environmental compliance efforts. DEC's fossil hydro generation portfolio consists of approximately 14,966 megawatts of generation capacity, which includes 6,764 megawatts of coal-fired generation, 3,245 megawatts of hydroelectric generation, 2,665 megawatts of natural gas combustion turbine generation, 2,083 megawatts of natural gas combined cycle generation, 170 megawatts of steam natural gas, and 39 megawatts of solar. The company's fossil hydro generating units operated efficiently and reliably during the review period. DEC's total system generation was 100.1 million megawatt hours, of which approximately 39% was provided by the fossil hydro fleet. The breakdown includes a 25% contribution from the coal-fired stations, approximately 11% contribution from combined cycle operations, 2% contribution from the CTs, 1% contribution from the fossil hydro facilities, from the hydro facilities, and 0.2% from the solar facilities. DEC has installed pollution control equipment on existing and new generation resources in order to meet various emission reduction requirements. Overall, the type and quantity of emission-reducing chemicals varies depending on generation output, chemical constituents in the fuel burned, and/or the level of emission reductions required. DEC manages the impact of changes to the fuel mix and/or coal burn due to competing fuels and utilization of non-traditional coals. The goal is to effectively comply with emission regulations and provide the most efficient total cost operating solution. This concludes my direct testimony summary.
Gentlemen, please answer any questions that the council or the commission have.
Okay, Mr. Elliott. Ms. Bowen. Mr. Nelson. Commissioners. Mr. Hamilton.
Thank you, Chairman. Hope you gentlemen dodged Florence on your way. Happy to have you here. Mr. Capps, you discussed in your direct testimony the Oconee outage of 28 hours due to a lockout. Could you tell me what a lockout is, what caused?
Yes, sir, I can. We were doing breaker failure relay testing in the Oconee Unit 3 switchyard. So the actual testing ensures that if a breaker failed to trip, that the surrounding breakers would open to isolate a fault. And over the course of doing that breaker failure testing, the relay technicians who were doing the testing got on one component above the component they should have been testing. So they made a human error and got on the incorrect component. Injected a breaker failure signal into that breaker. That particular breaker was one of Unit 3's generator output breakers. So the breaker failure signal caused that breaker and the adjacent Unit 3 output breaker trip, which caused the unit to shut.
Thank you, sir. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Commissioner Hamilton. Commissioners, any other questions? Commissioner Howard.
Thank you. Mr. Martin, you stated in your testimony that with Lee you added, 753 megawatts of electricity. However, you closed several hydro plants or retired them. What would be the net gain of megawatts considering those two factors?
W.S. Lee was approximately 753 megawatts. We shut down two very small hydro units, and so just a few megawatts total from those two hydro plants were shut down.
Let me get this one off the table. Do you expect any problem with dry ash in Florence, with Hurricane Florence?
So the only ash-related issue that I'm aware of from Florence is at our Sutton facility. This is a Duke Energy Progress facility. In the landfill, we're currently excavating the ash from the pond at Sutton and placing it in a landfill. That landfill will ultimately have a synthetic liner over it, have approximately 2 feet of topsoil and grass when it's done. But during this phase, it was susceptible to Florence. So a very historic rain event. We did have some erosion on that landfill. Vast majority of the ash stayed within the landfill perimeter or on our property. A very small amount, I would say a slip of no more than 25 to 30 feet, went on to an adjacent property. But once we're able to get heavy equipment in there, we should have that cleaned up within a couple days.
But you're over the danger. I mean, you have no flooding problem coming up, you know, of anticipated?
The hydro systems continue to rise. Even though we have clear skies today, the runoff continues to increase the level in some of our rivers. But we anticipate no further ash issues, and we anticipate no further hydro issues.
Thank you. You talked about on page 10 of your testimony, I think Allen Units 1 and 5, you did some dry ass conversion projects. What about the other stations? Are they then done? Are you plan on doing the dry ass conversion of those other stations?
I think Allen was the last plant to convert to dry fly ash. We are currently in the process of converting to dry bottom ash systems, or at least closed loop bottom ash systems, to comply with both the Coal Ash Management Act in North Carolina and also the Coal Combustion Residual Rule, which is a federal rule.
Mr. Capps, yes, I got a trip brief, but you have an Exhibit 2. But then Exhibit 3 is confidential without breaching any confidentiality. They look like almost similar exhibits. What makes Exhibit 3 confidential and Exhibit 2 is not?
Commissioner, I believe Exhibit 2 is a reflection of past completed outages. Exhibit 3 is a plan for future outages. So just from a business standpoint, we do not normally publish future outages or durations.
I'm just curious about the difference. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Commissioner Howard. Anybody else? Mr. Capps, I've got a question for you. On page 11 of your pre-file testimony, you're talking about Catawba Unit 2's removal from the grid for refueling and other activities. And after the completion of the outage, the unit was briefly removed from the grid for 6.2 hours to complete planned turbine overspeed testing. I probably ought to know this, but what's turbine overspeed testing?
So the turbine normally operates at 1,800 revolutions per minute, and there is an overspeed trip system so that if the control valves that control steam admission to the turbine, if you had a problem with those and the turbine started speeding up, then at a predefined set point, it would trip the turbine and close the valves, essentially to protect the turbine. So on a periodic basis, we have to test that overspeed protection function. So we station an operator to manually trip the turbine in the event it were to have a problem. And then we slowly raise turbine speed above 1,800 RPM to the trip set point to verify that it will, in fact, trip and protect the turbine.
Gotcha. Does that count as an additional outage, or is that part of the planned outage when you talk about an additional few hours?
I think it is listed separately in Exhibit 2 as an additional outage. For our purposes, in terms of planning a refueling outage, we lump it all together and manage it as one.
Thank you. Commissioners, any other questions? Not any redirect? All right, then. Thank you, gentlemen, and you may step down. And Mr. Elby, you may call your next panel.
And please bring your placards with you. Thank you. Grant, we'll start with you. Would you state your name for the record, please?
That's Eric S. Grant.
And by whom are you employed and in what capacity?
Duke Energy, and I'm the Vice President of Fuels and System Optimization.
And did you cause to be prepared 8 pages of testimony that was pre-filed in this docket?
Yes, I did.
If I were to ask you the questions contained in your pre-filed testimony today, would your answers be the same?
Yes, they would.
Mr. Chairman, we'd ask that Eric Grant's 8 pages of testimony be copied in the record as if given from the stand.
Mr. Grant's pre-filed direct testimony will be entered into the record as given orally from the stand.
Mr. Grant, are there 2 exhibits to your two-page exhibits attached to your testimony?
Yes, they are.
Mr. Chairman, we'd ask that Mr. Grant's 2 exhibits be admitted as the next hearing exhibit, please.
Okay, Mr. Grant's exhibits will be entered as exhibit number 3.
And Mr. Grant, did you cause to be prepared 6 pages of rebuttal testimony that was pre-filed in this docket?
Yes, I did.
If I were to ask you the questions contained in your rebuttal testimony today, would your answers be the same?
Yes, they would.
Mr. Chairman, we'd ask that Mr. Grant's rebuttal testimony be copied in the record as if given from the stand.
And Mr. Grant's rebuttal testimony will be entered into the record as given orally from the stand.
Mr. Grant, are you prepared to summarize your direct and rebuttal testimony for the commission?
Yes, I am.
Would you please do that, please?
The purpose of my testimony is to provide fossil fuel costs for the period June 1st, 2017 through May 31st, 2018, and describe changes forthcoming for the period October 1st, 2018 through September 30th, 2019. Duke Energy Carolina's average delivered cost of coal per ton for the review period was $75.45 per ton compared to $78.29 per ton in the prior review period, representing a decrease of 4%. This includes an average transportation cost of $26.80 per ton in the review period compared to a $26.42 per ton in the prior review period, representing an increase of approximately 1%. DEC's average cost of gas purchased for the review period was $4 per MMBTU as compared to $3.54 per MMBTU in the prior review period, representing an increase of 13%. These costs include gas supply, transportation, storage, and financial hedging. DEC's coal burn for the review period was 9.5 million tons compared to a coal burn of 10.6 million tons in the prior review period, representing a decrease of 10%. DEC consumed approximately 94.7 million MMBTUs of natural gas in the review period compared to 84 million MMBTUs in the prior review period, representing an increase of 13%. Primary contributing factors were the new Lee combined cycle facility becoming commercially available April 5, 2018, coupled with changes in commodity prices and weather-driven demand. DEC's projections for the billing period include approximately 6.8 million tons of coal and 166.5 million MMBTUs of natural gas consumed. With the net increase in DEC's overall natural gas burn projections for the billing period versus the review period being driven by the new Lee combined cycle facility and the inclusion of natural gas generation at Cliffside as a result of the dual fuel conversion becoming commercially available in late 2018. These projections are subject to change due to multiple factors, most notably but not limited to changes in commodity prices and weather-driven demand. This concludes my testimony summary.
Sir. Mr. Church, would you state your name for the record, please?
Yes, Kenneth D. Church.
By whom are you employed and what capacity?
I'm employed by Duke Energy Corporation. My title is General Manager, Fuel Management and Design, Nuclear Engineering.
And did you cause to be prepared 9 pages of testimony that's been pre-filed in this document?
Sir, I did.
If I were to ask you the questions contained in that pre-filed testimony today, would your answer be the same?
Yes, I would.
Mr. Chairman, we'd ask that Mr. Church's direct testimony be copied into the record as if given.
Mr. Church's pre-filed direct testimony will be entered into the record as is given orally from the stand.
Chairman, Mr. Church, were there 2 exhibits attached to your pre-filed testimony?
Yes, there were.
Mr. Chairman, we'd ask that Mr. Church's 2 exhibits be admitted into the record as the next hearing exhibit.
Mr. Church's 2 exhibits will be entered into the record as exhibit number 4.
Church, would you summarize your testimony?
Yes, I sure would. Purpose of my testimony is to provide information regarding DEC's nuclear fuel purchasing practices, provide costs for the June 1st, 2017 through May 31st, 2018 review period, and describe changes for the October 1st, 2018 through September 30th, 2019 billing. DEC's nuclear fuel procurement practices involve computing near and long-term consumption forecasts, establishing nuclear system inventory levels, projecting required annual fuel purchases, requesting proposals from qualified suppliers, negotiating a portfolio of long-term contracts from diverse sources of supply, and monitoring deliveries against contract commitments. Consistent with industry practices, long-term contracts are used extensively to cover forward requirements and ensure security of supply. DEC's portfolio of diversified contract pricing yielded an average unit cost of $44.60 per pound of uranium concentrates during the review period, representing an increase of 11% per pound from the prior review period. The average unit cost of DEC's purchases of enrichment services during the review period decreased 24% to $106.58 per separative work unit. Delivered costs for fabrication and conversion services have a limited impact on the overall fuel expense rate, given that the dollar amounts for these purchases represent a substantially smaller percentage of DEC's total direct fuel cost relative to uranium concentrates or enrichment. DEC anticipates a decrease in nuclear fuel costs on a cents per kilowatt hour basis through the next billing period. Because fuel is typically expensed over 2 to 3 operating cycles, roughly 3 to 6 years, DEC's nuclear fuel expense in the upcoming billing period will be determined by the cost of fuel assemblies loaded into the reactors during the review period, as well as prior. Average fuel expense is expected to decrease from 0.652 cents per kilowatt hour incurred during the review period to approximately 0.631 cents per kilowatt hour in the billing. This concludes my testimony summary.
Gentlemen, please answer any questions from council.
Thank you. Mr. Elliott. Ms. Bowen. Mr. Nelson. Any redirect? Oops. Commissioners, I was just moving along at a great clip right there. Commissioner Elam.
You were just wanting to cut me off, I know. Mr. Grant, I'm looking at page 5 of your direct testimony, and the paragraph at the top you discuss the reduction in coal burn and the increase in natural gas burn, and you also talk about the Lee plant being brought online the last 2 months of the year, correct?
Right. It came online in April of 2018.
What effect do you expect the new Lee combined cycle plant to have on fuel costs when it's available for a full 12-month period?
Well, assuming that gas prices stay where they're at today, of course, we would expect that to basically displace additional coal going forward, especially in the DEC portfolio.
How much? I mean, did you use this that availability in conducting your fuel forecast?
Absolutely. I mean, that unit would have been basically put in the forward forecast, of course, based on what the targeted or what we're seeing as market prices for both coal and natural gas. And it does have a high capacity factor looking out through the life of that unit.
Okay. What reduction in coal would that result in, assuming everything else is equal?
Yeah, in the DEC, since DEC is a standalone balancing authority, you're still going to have to run some coal to meet reserve requirements. But by and large, it's a 750 megawatt unit. You're going to see it predominantly displace approximately that amount of coal burn on a daily basis. Again, since it's going to be a base loaded unit, at least that's part of the forecast.
Okay, thank you.
Commissioner Irvin.
Mr. Chairman, thank you, sir. Mr. Church, it's good to have you with us today.
Good to be here.
I was looking at your direct testimony, page 6, beginning at line 12, states that the DEC's nuclear portfolio or diversified contract pricing yielded an average unit cost of $44.60 per pound for uranium concentrates during the review period. This represents an increase of 11% per pound from the prior review period. In a recent Duke Energy Progress Fuel case, I believe that was docket number 2018-1-E, witness Kevin Houston testified that DEP's average unit cost was $31.72 per pound for uranium concentrates of the review period, which represented a decrease of 13% per pound. So would you please compare and contrast the differences here in pricing for uranium in the DEC versus the DEP?
Yeah, so some of the contracts that we're taking deliveries under today were actually in place before the merger. So since that point in time, we've looked to sign contracts that split volumes essentially between the two affiliates. For DEC in the prior review period, we purchased a large amount of spot material, which pulled down the average price during that prior period because we were buying uranium at a low point in the market. Since that point in time, the market price has started to increase. So that explains the higher price in the DEC portfolio during this review period.
Is uranium have an open market where you can buy options for or futures, so to speak, to try to lock in a price?
There is a limited amount of that type of activity, but it is very limited.
Probably not worth spending a lot of time on. Is that what you're saying?
We have found that we can hedge our risk by contracting in the long-term market for fixed prices, and we can take on some additional risk by securing market-related contracts, which are the prices are based on time of delivery price. So we do diversify our pricing mechanisms in the portfolio to take advantage of those.
On page 7 of your pre-file direct, you state that the company anticipates a decrease in nuclear fuel costs on a cents per kilowatt hour basis through the net billing period. My question is, will the expected decrease in nuclear fuel cost bring the company closer in line with the DEP's cost?
It will bring it closer, yes, absolutely.
And has the expected decrease been included in the company's forecasted fuel costs for the billing period?
Could you restate that?
Yes, sir. The expected decrease that we're talking about?
Yes, sir.
Has that been factored into the company's forecasted fuel cost for the billing period?
Yes, it sure has.
Thank you.
Okay. Anyone? Any other? Okay, now, Mr. Ellerby, any redirect? That's a good thing. Thank you. Okay, gentlemen, thank you. You may step down. And you may call your third panel.
Snyder, we'll start with you since you're closest to me. Would you state your name for the record, please?
Glenn A. Snyder.
By whom are you employed and in what capacity?
Duke Energy as Director of Integrated Resource Planning and Analytics for the Carolinas.
And did you cause to be prepared 6 pages of testimony that was filed in this document?
I did.
If I were to ask you the questions contained in your direct testimony today, would your answers be the same?
Yes, they would.
Mr. Chairman, we'd ask that Mr. Snyder's direct testimony be copied in the record as if given from the stand.
Mr. Snyder's pre-filed direct testimony will be entered into the record as if given orally from the stand.
And Mr. Snyder, have you also caused to be prepared and filed in this docket 11 pages of rebuttal testimony?
I did.
If I were to ask you the questions contained in your rebuttal testimony today, would your answers be the same?
Yes, they would.
Mr. Chairman, we'd ask that Mr. Snyder's rebuttal testimony be copied in the record as if given from the stand.
Mr. Snyder's rebuttal, I'm getting rebuttal and Snyder all confused there. Mr. Snyder's rebuttal testimony will be entered into the record as if given orally from the stand.
Mr. Snyder, would you summarize your direct and rebuttal testimony for the Commission?
Yes, I would. Chairman Randall, Commissioners, good morning. The purpose of my testimony is to support the company's calculation of the components of the value of net energy metering distributed energy resources. DEC has updated the 2018 value of NEM distributed energy resources to 0.05323 per kilowatt hour for schedules RS, RE, ES, RT, and SGS, and a value of $0.05310 for all other schedules. This calculation is consistent with the methodology approved in order number 2015-194. My rebuttal testimony addresses issues raised by South Carolina Coastal Conservation League and Southern Alliance for Clean Energy witness Debbie Glick. I disagree with witness Glick that net energy metering distributed energy resources, also called NEM-DER, avoid transmission and distribution investment by the company and therefore should be assigned a value greater than 0. Given the intermittency, lack of coincidence, non-dispatchability, and uncertainty in NEM-DER location and quantity, it is not appropriate to assign avoided transmission or distribution benefits to an NEM-DER. My testimony also rebuts witness Glick's opinion on the inclusion of costs related to coal ash disposal in the value of NEM-DER. My testimony explains that the variable operation costs associated with coal ash disposal are already included within the avoided energy component of the calculation of NEM-DER. Also, my testimony rebuts witness Glick's opinion that capital costs associated with building new coal ash impoundments should be included for purposes of calculating NEM-DER. This concludes my testimony summary.
Thank you, sir. Mr. Martin, would you state your name for the record, please?
Yes, Jason D. Martin.
By whom are you employed and in what capacity, sir?
I'm employed by Duke Energy, and I'm the Director of Strategy and Policy for South Carolina for Distributed Energy Technologies.
And have you caused to be prepared 13 pages of testimony that was pre-filed in this document?
Yes, I have.
If I were to ask you the questions contained in that testimony today, would your answers be the same?
Yes, they would.
Mr. Chairman, we'd ask that Mr. Martin's direct testimony be copied in the record as it's given.
Mr. Martin's pre-filed direct testimony will be entered into the record as if given orally from the stand.
Mr. Martin, is there one exhibit attached to your pre-filed testimony?
Yes, there is.
Mr. Chairman, we'd ask that Mr. Martin's exhibit be admitted into the record as the next hearing exhibit.
Mr. Martin's exhibit will be entered into the record as exhibit number 5.
Sure. Martin, would you summarize your testimony?
Thank you. Good morning, Chairman, Commissioners. The purpose of my testimony is to provide support for the Distributed Energy Resource Program, or DERP, costs that are incorporated into the proposed fuel factors by witness McGee. I will describe the nature of the cost as well as any changes made to the DIRT portfolio since the 2017 fuel proceeding. DEC incurred DIRT costs totaling $8,219,258 in the review period, anticipates incurring $3,608,220 during the forecast period, and projects to incur $12,215,510 in the billing period. These costs represent the avoided and incremental costs associated with the company's approved DIRT offerings, including the purchase power agreements executed to fulfill the company's utility scale goals under Act 236, distributed energy resource net energy metering incentive, the solar rebate program, shared solar program, carrying cost on deferred amounts, NEM avoided capacity cost, NEM meter cost, and general and administrative expenses, including incremental labor cost as a direct result of DERP, IT, and billing enhancements and other administrative costs associated with delivering these programs to customers. This concludes my testimony summary.
Would you state your name for the record, please? And what is by whom are you employed and in what capacity?
I'm employed by Duke Energy
Ms.
Carolinas.
McGee, get a little closer to that microphone. It's not quite picking you up.
Okay. I'm employed by Duke Energy Carolinas as a rates manager, supporting both Duke Energy Carolinas and Duke Energy Progress in rider filings and base rate proceedings.
Ms. McGee, have you caused to be prepared 16 pages of direct testimony that was pre-filed in this docket? If I were to ask you the questions in your direct testimony today, would your answers be the same?
Yes, they would.
Mr. Chairman, we'd ask that Ms. McGee's direct testimony be copied in the record as if given from the stand.
Ms. McGee's pre-filed direct testimony will be entered into the record as if given orally from the stand.
And Ms. McGee, there are exhibits attached to your direct testimony. I believe there are 14 exhibits. Is that correct?
That is correct.
Mr. Chairman, we'd ask that Ms. McGee's direct exhibits be entered into the record. The next exhibit.
Ms. McGee's direct exhibits 1 through 14 will be entered into the record as exhibit number 6.
And Ms. McGee, have you also caused to be prepared 4 pages of rebuttal testimony that responded to certain issues that the energy users witness Kevin O'Donnell had raised?
Yes.
Okay. If I were to ask you the questions contained in your rebuttal testimony, your 4 pages of rebuttal testimony today, would your answers be the same?
Yes, they would.
Mr. Chairman, we'd ask that Ms. McGee's rebuttal testimony be copied into the record as if given from the stand.
Ms. McGee's rebuttal testimony will be entered into the record as if given orally from the stand.
You and Ms. McGee, have you also caused to be prepared 3 pages of supplemental testimony that was pre-filed in this docket?
Yes.
And is this supplemental testimony supporting the matters covered in the stipulation that was entered into the record by Mr. Nelson of ORS?
Yes, it is.
Okay. If I were to ask you the questions contained in your supplemental testimony, would your answers be the same?
Yes, they would.
Mr. Chairman, we'd ask that Ms. McGee's supplemental testimony be copied in the record as if given from.
Ms. McGee's supplemental testimony will be entered into the record as if given orally from the stand.
And Ms. McGee, are there exhibits attached to your supplemental testimony?
Yes, there are.
Can you describe those exhibits? Am I correct that those exhibits actually substitute for and correct some of the first set of exhibits? Is that correct?
That is correct. Exhibit 1 replaces the Exhibit 1 that I filed with my direct testimony. It incorporates all the changes that were agreed to in the stipulation. Exhibit 3 also replaces Exhibit 3 from my direct testimony, and it also incorporates the changes that were agreed to in the stipulation. Exhibit 9 and Exhibit 11 replace those same exhibits in my direct testimony, and those exhibits are also supporting the stipulation, but as well they are incorporating changes that the ORS found during their audit to the number of DERP accounts.
Mr. Chairman, just for clarity, we thought it would be appropriate to give the Commission both the original set of exhibits and the substituted one. So we'd ask that Ms. McGee's, the exhibits that she has described attached to her supplemental testimony be entered into the record as the next hearing.
Okay, Ms. McGee's supplemental revised exhibits 1, 3, 9, and 11 will be entered into the record as exhibit number 7.
And Ms. McGee, would you summarize your testimony, please?
Yes. The purpose of my direct, rebuttal, and supplemental testimony is to provide DEC's actual cost related to fuel, capacity, environmental, and its Distributed Energy Resource Program, also known as DERP. Cost data for June 1st, 2017 through May 31st, 2018. The projected fuel capacity-related cost, environmental, and DERP cost information for June 1st, 2018 through September 30th, 2018, and DEC's proposed fuel factors by customer class for October 1st, 2018 through September 30th, 2019. On September 10th, 2018, DEC filed a stipulation entered into by DEC, the Office of Regulatory Staff, and the South Carolina Energy Users Committee. All amounts and rates that I will discuss and contained in my revised Exhibits 1, 3, 9, and 11 filed on September 10th, 2018 are in accordance with this stipulation. DEC's recommended base fuel rate for the billing period is 1.6160 cents per kWh to recover the South Carolina retail share of the $1.5 billion of projected system fuel expense. The projected South Carolina retail fuel expense was reduced by $34 million as agreed to in the stipulation. The true-up component of 0.3488 cents per kWh is to recoup the projected $75.6 million under recovery as of September 30th, 2018. Environmental, capacity-related cost, and DERP avoided cost are allocated to residential, general service, and industrial rate classes based upon the firm coincident peak demand. Variable environmental cost and the cost of emission allowances allocated to the South Carolina retail jurisdiction during the review period were approximately $6.4 million, with an expected $1.4 million over collection balance at September 30th, 2018. South Carolina's retail portion forecasted cost for the billing period is approximately $5.2 million. The environmental cost components are 0.0166 cents per kWh for residential, 0.0193 cents per kWh for general service, and 0.0168 cents per kWh for industrial. Capacity-related costs allocated to the South Carolina retail jurisdiction during the review period were approximately $13.1 million, with an expected environmental over-recovery balance of almost $397,000 at September 30th, 2018. South Carolina's retail portion forecasted for the billing period is $23.9 million. The capacity-related cost components are 0.1274 cents per kWh for residential, 0.1158 cents per kWh for general service, and 0.0901 cents per kWh for industrial. The expected DERP avoided cost under collection balance at September 30th, 2018 is almost $19,500. South Carolina's retail portion forecasted for the billing period is just over $80,000. This results in DERP avoided cost factors of 0.0006 cents per kWh for residential, 0.0005 cent per kWh for general service, and 0.0004 cents per kWh for industrial. The company's DERP incremental costs were approximately $8.2 million during the review period, $3.6 million for the estimated period. Total DERP incremental cost of $11.9 million are projected for the billing period. DEC allocated 100% of DERP incremental cost to residential, general service, and industrial rate classes based upon firm peak demand. The proposed DERP per account charges, including the true-up component per month of 89 cents, $4.28, and $100 for South Carolina residential, general, and industrial customers, excluding GRT, are within the statutory per-account cost caps established in Act 236. The company's actual fuel-related, and DERP cost incurred are reasonable and reflect DEC's continuing efforts to maintain reliable service and an economical generation mix, thereby minimizing the total cost of providing service to DEC's South Carolina retail customers. DEC believes the stipulation represents a fair, reasonable, and full resolution of the issues addressed therein and should be accepted by the Commission as being in the public interest. The impact of the rates set forth in the proposed stipulation for an average residential customer using 1,000 kilowatt hours per month is an increase of $3.17, or 2.8%. Impacts for general and industrial customers vary by customer, but are increases of approximately 3.2% and 5% respectively. This concludes my testimony summary.
Ma'am, the three of you please answer the question.
Mr. Elliott. Bowen. Mr. Nelson. Commissioners. Commissioner Williams.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have a question for Ms. McGee. Good afternoon, ma'am.
Good afternoon.
On page 16 of your pre-filed direct testimony, you state that the total base fuel factors for the billing period are increasing primarily due to a larger undercollection of fuel costs included in the 2018 proposed base fuel rates as a result of extreme weather conditions in January 2018. First question is this. Did other factors besides extreme weather conditions in January 2018 contribute to the change in the base fuel cost factors? If so, would you mind elaborating?
Sure. Let me just kind of step you through our process. Maybe that'll help a little. The way that we establish our projection is we get a load forecast, and that load forecast then determines, what projected units we need to run in order to dispatch appropriately in the most economical manner in order to meet that load. And then we have to determine, okay, so for those units that are going to meet that load, what's the fuel costs that are associated with those units? And that sounds very simple on the surface, but the hourly dispatch model that's run to create the projection is very complex. And so there's a lot of inputs that go into creating the projection. There's weather, there is customer demand, there's solar impacts, there's commodity prices. So when our projections are set, we're trying to do the best job we can to estimate what we think we're going to incur in our review period. We had a large under collection this review period, and I would say close to 50% of it was related to the weather change in January. We did not anticipate having such a cold January. It was the second coldest 9-day period in like the last 40 years. So it was a really hard time to meet the demand. Our peak was really high. We had to buy a lot of power. We were running all of our units, and costs were high. Outside of that, we had an item in the projection that did not pan out the way that we thought it would. We thought that the Lee CC plant would come online November 1st, and so that's what we had baked into our projection, into our dispatch model, and it didn't come online until April 5th. That resulted in us having to purchase power that was more expensive than what we had planned, as well as run more higher cost plants than what we had planned. So those were the two primary drivers. We don't have anything else I can specifically point to. I have dug into month by month comparisons and could not find anything really specific. But there's just so many variables that go into that projection that it is hard to put your finger on one thing and say that is it.
Okay. Thank you. One more question for you. Under the fuel components agreed to in the stipulation, what would an average residential customer's monthly bill be for a customer who uses 1,000 kilowatt hours per month?
Under the stipulation?
Yes, that's correct.
It's going to be $3.17.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Commissioner Williams. Commissioners, Commissioner Hamilton.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, but I had a question for Ms. McGeehan, but her thorough and complete answer, Mr. Williams. Happy to have all of it.
Thank you. Commissioner Elam.
Thank you. Good morning. Mr. Martin, start with you. The table 1 on page 3 of your testimony deals with solar adoption. And there, the table lists 10.6 megawatts, or 27% of its total capacity under contract. And note 3 shows that the capacity under contract is defined as those having executed a purchase power agreement. Has the company received power under those agreements?
No, we have not. The commercial operation date has not come yet. We expect those online towards the end of this year.
What is the company's plan to meet the remainder of its Act 236 goal?
We offered an initial RFP for the first fulfillment, and out of that, currently we have the 10.6 megawatts of PPAs assigned. We have extended a second RFP, which closed out recently, to attract more interest in fulfilling that, and we expect to be able to fulfill the obligation. So, tracks. Okay.
So you're in negotiations with?
Yes, sir.
Somebody.
Okay.
To get somebody's. Mr. Snyder, I'm looking at Ms. Glick's rebuttal testimony on page 3, talking about impact on transmission systems. Do you agree that NEMDER projects have the ability to reduce load on transmission systems?
I do agree that they can reduce load. That doesn't necessarily mean reduce cost.
Okay. Can you be more specific about that? Is that not having to add more capacity to a transmission line?
Right. So transmission lines, I think the fundamental area of disagreement between myself and Ms. Glick is that the assumption that just because you reduce load on a transmission line, that reduces investment in that line. In certain cases, you could probably come up with an example where that may be the case. But what we're seeing now, especially with the advent of a lot of distributed solar generation, so a lot of these 1, 2, 5 megawatt, 50 megawatt facilities around the system, is areas that used to be load pockets. And what I mean by a load versus a generation pocket, certain areas on the grid are rich in generation, and they're pushing power out to where the load is. Other areas are load pockets. That's where all the load is, and so it's coming in. And so that's a simple way to think about it. However, what we're seeing now is what used to be some load pockets now can become generation pockets because you're adding a lot of commercial scale solar in a given region. And so what happens is that solar there, and you've seen this in our transmission queue, it's so large, we're not seeing reduced costs. We're saying to accommodate all of this, we're going to have to invest in additional transmission to move that solar where it needs to go. And so what happens is if you do net energy metered in certain locations, we were counting on the load there to be used to consume the solar that was already built there. Now, if you reduce that load, you have to push that solar somewhere else. And so now you're actually making what was a generation pocket an even deeper generation pocket because you're reducing load in that area. And that can actually result in an increased cost in transmission investment. And so that's where we differ. It's just the fact that now load flows are changing, and it's really about having to make sure you have the adequate transmission to accommodate changing load flows.
Also, I believe, in response to her, has ample time elapsed to conduct an analysis on T&D avoided capacity?
I think ample analysis on T&D means a lot of different things to a lot of different people. I mean, we are doing extensive T&D analysis on the queue itself. So we have expanded staff in our transmission and distribution planning departments to accommodate all of the distributed solar that's happening to date. And what we're seeing, again, is as we're studying thousands of megawatts in the queue, is trying to study with the more detailed models that Ms. Glick references, what are the impacts on the transmission system and how do we mitigate those? And what we're seeing is as you add all of this, again, we're seeing an expense, but that's at the sort of the commercial scale. And so when you bring it down to the NEM level and rooftop solar, it really does become more of a system-wide impact that will vary by region. And so our contention is we do not see a net benefit at this point, and that to evaluate what the actual benefits and cost are will be very regional specific and will depend on where that rooftop starts aggregating and how much we have. And at this point, we do not believe that study exists to justify imposing a cost or a benefit, and that's why we're leaving it at 0.
Give me a real world example of what could be a reduced cost for transmission or an increased cost for transmission given generation pockets of rooftop solar or commercial solar.
So assuming you had a net, and again, we talk a lot about what's a net dependable firm resource in solar. So assuming you could depend on solar to be there at the time of peak to serve that particular load, and that solar, and maybe other jurisdictions are different than ours, where maybe they peak at 2 in the afternoon and their load pocket is exactly in one area and their generation pocket is in another, and the solar is a certain amount of it, not all of it, is dependable. You could see an example where maybe some jurisdiction would say, because I am reducing my peak, I now need less transmission to move from point A to point B. And so in that example, you would ascribe a potential benefit to transmission. In our case, that is not the case where we have that situation. We peak, and now in both DEC and DEP, we're what we call peak planning. In other words, we plan for winter morning peaks at 6 to 7, 7 to 8, and that is not a time of day where you can have net dependable, and that's assuming you actually would benefit from the load being reduced in that area, which is not the case in every area on our grid. Certain areas we do not benefit from the transmission by reducing load. We actually have generation in the area that's trying to push out. And so it's both a locational and it's a time of day issue for us. And that's where, again, just because other jurisdictions are seeing this doesn't mean that we should ascribe it here in the Carolinas.
What about distribution? An example of what could be an increased cost for distribution or a reduced cost for distribution?
Distribution is much more geographically granular. So you have, a lot of distribution nodes, smaller number of customers, smaller geographic region. And so your intermittency at the distribution level is considerably higher than on a system-wide level. You think about cloud covers moving through, they can have much bigger impacts on a small geographic region. And in addition to that, what you see with rooftop solar is sometimes it's helping offset load, and sometimes it's putting load onto the distribution circuit. So any rooftop solar, even if on a monthly basis you're consuming more than you're producing, on any given day you're pushing power onto the grid and consuming it from the grid. So you have this two-way flow that's creating issues on your distribution system that can actually cause you to have to invest in that distribution system to accommodate those two-way flows. And so you're seeing, you definitely see that much more at the distribution level than necessarily at the transmission.
And what is that? New transformers, new substation?
I'm going to caveat mine with the full acknowledgement that I am not a distribution engineer, but I've talked to them extensively and asked the same questions. So you have voltage regulators, capacitors, you have the sizing of your transformers and the lines that are needed to serve that. And so all of that, when they plan for what do I need to serve the peak load, again, a lot of our circuits are winter peaking that see peaks in the winter when solar is not there. But even during the day when it is there, sometimes it's reducing demand on the distribution system, sometimes it's increasing, putting power back to the distribution system. So that's what causes you to have to carefully look at each piece of that equipment that I just mentioned and say, do I have it sized to accommodate this new flow of power?
Last question, and I'll give Ms. Glick a crack at this as well. I'm trying to understand whether the two of you disagree on distribution. Because sometimes when I see her testimony, when she's responding saying, well, that's not necessarily true of transmission. And I don't necessarily see distribution addressed. Is there, from your standpoint, do you still have a disagreement with Ms. Glick, or is she on the same page as you on distribution?
As I understand it, Ms. Glick is not in this proceeding asking to have a distribution benefit ascribed. It is her calculation she goes through in her exhibit. The one I do not agree with is predominantly focused on transmission. And so I think our primary area of disagreement is avoided transmission benefits.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner Elam. Commissioner Howard.
Thank you very much. I have a couple of questions. Mr. Martin, on page 7 of your pre-file testimony, you state the distributed energy resources and net metering incentives, and that cost is going to grow significantly in the next billing period. And because of interconnection of operational facilities, do you expect that number to decrease, level off at that point? At that point, what do you see happening with the incentives?
Yes, we expect that we still have projects that are coming on connection, actually to the system, which at that point the incentive would be ascribed to those customers. And so once that is complete and all of the customers have made their connections, that should level off at that point, the incentive portion.
Next two questions are questions that I put in my mind as questions that can make me look like the idiot that I am. But I got questions. And Ms. McGee, why 5%? I mean, it just seems like that a fuel cost is such a precise, numerical-driven number. Then all of a sudden we see a cap, so to speak, of 5%. And what does that play into the fuel cost percentage?
The 5% cap was an agreed upon number with South Carolina Energy Users Committee. They felt like that was a fair increase to ascribe to their customers, that it would not be too burdensome for them. And so in light of the large under collection that we had, we felt that it was in the consumer's best interest if we could defer that $34 million so that we could reduce those costs.
Coincidence that the energy users figure now is 5%?
No.
All right, Mr. Snyder, I got a couple questions for you. I want you to talk to me about line loss. 6% looked like a pretty significant figure in your marginal.
Yeah, that was the for the capacity component, not the energy round the clock type of energy. So for the capacity component, it was the marginal line loss coincident with the time of peak, and so that's not applied to the total energy losses. That's a much smaller number.
Is there anything you as a company can do to reduce the line loss?
Again, not being a T&D engineer, I know that is an issue that as they invest in the grid and modernize some of the grid, that they're hoping to reduce those line losses. And I don't know exactly what's involved in that, so I can't speak to it in great detail.
There are a couple of components making up a line loss, and if certainly from point of generation to the substation, let's say this might be one line loss factor.
That's right.
from the substation to transmission to the distribution point might be another one, and distribution to the end use. What are those numbers? Do you know?
In general, your higher voltage has lower line losses. So, your transmission system at the higher voltages have lower line losses than once you go down to transformation from a transmission to distribution substation and move power through the distribution system at lower voltage levels. Those have higher line losses associated at the distribution. And again, not to be exactly precise on the number, but think of more in the 2% range for transmission and maybe 4% or so. Again, not quoting those exactly, but higher at the distribution level.
What role in the future do you see EVs playing on your distribution system or transmission system?
I think there's a wide view on just how EVs will come into play, both the pace in which EVs get introduced on the system, but also just how they're managed on the system. Like, where are they charged in the homes once they become mass? At what time of day they're charged? Do they get charged at central stations at work? And I think until that all plays out, it's going to be difficult to say exactly what impact they're going to have on the distribution system. I know we have a growing group that is looking at that very issue.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Commissioner Howard. Commissioner Williams.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This question is for Mr. Snyder. On page 5 of your pre-filed direct testimony describing why some values on Table 1 are listed as 0, you state that the company has identified several components as 0 because insufficient data and analysis exist to quantify the cost or benefit of that component, or because the company believes the actual numerical value is 0. Which line items, on Table 1 does the company believe have an actual numerical value of 0?
So at this point, if I just go through them, ancillary services, we certainly believe that that's a cost that we've yet to quantify. So that is not one that we believe is 0. We just do not have, at this point, have that number quantified. T&D capacity benefits, that's the issue that we're in debate today over. What, again, as I've stated, what we've seen this applies to the NEM rooftop. What we're seeing for distributed and transmission level connected solar, when we study this in aggregate, is that we're seeing a cost, but we have not quantified a cost to put into the NEM as a system-wide cost. Avoided criteria pollutants is already a non-zero. CO2 emissions is 0 until such time that we have carbon regulation that would place a price on that. That's why the placeholder is there. So should we get a CO2 tax or some form of carbon regulation, that would then be a non-zero value. Fuel hedge, we believe, is appropriately 0. We're not seeing a hedge value that we're avoiding, no costs that we're avoiding for fuel hedging. So we believe that's appropriately 0. Integration and interconnection cost, again, at the NEM level, is something that we at this time do not have a study, but we certainly don't see that being a benefit at some point. That could become a cost. Administrative costs are 0 at this point, and environmental costs right now, we have our environmental expenses associated with reagents, some of the environmental costs. We are variable O&M costs to run our plants. Those are currently captured in the avoided energy, and we will look to in the future, it's really going into the complex models Ms. McGee spoke about and pulling out some very small inputs that go into that are currently buried within the avoided energy. We think, there is potential in the future to pull those out and put those on the environmental cost line.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Snyder. I have one more question for you. When does the company anticipate being able to quantify values for the items that have insufficient data and analysis?
I think, it's going to differ for each one of these. The one that's real and in front of us right now is as you grow the amount of intermittent resources on the system, you need to have more operating reserves in place to balance the system in real time. So that's what I'm talking about there, is the ability to move every minute, every 10 minutes, every hour, to move up and down and follow load. As you add more intermittent resources, you need more operating reserves to do that. We are currently working on studies to do that, and I would anticipate, in the months and literally in the months to come, having values that will be prepared to populate on that. That's the nearest term one. Some of the other ones that we believe are costs, to get it at the system level at a rate for what's ready for implementation for a general rate, I think those are longer term. A lot of these that are locational specific are very tough to put into a general rate, where you can come up with a specific example of where you might get a benefit in one location under just the right set of circumstances, but there's a whole other set of locations or installations where there's a cost. And so then trying to estimate what the total average net benefit or cost is going to be very difficult. So those are a little bit longer term, I think.
Thank you, Mr. Snyder. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. That's all I have.
Thank you, Commissioner. Mr. Snyder, Ms. Glick recommends on page 9 and 10 of her rebuttal testimony to break out coal ash expenses into avoided environmental cost. Why are avoided coal ash amounts included in avoided energy and not broken out? I think you've already talked a little bit about that.
Right. And the one that we do have in energy now is actually the cost of handling coal ash. So again, about 10% of coal turns into ash, and as Witness Miller attested to, we are moving all of our facilities to dry fly and dry bottom ash. And as we produce that ash, that ash gets handled and moved into on-site landfills. That's a very small component of our variable O&M cost within our modeling that Ms. McGee referenced. And so that is an item that would take some post-processing to sort of pull out. It is a very small number relative to the total avoided fuel cost, which is the big energy and other variable O&M expenses. So at some point in time, the handling of that coal ash, that's right now just one constituent of our variable O&M, could potentially be pulled out as part of a variable O&M for running the plant and placed into the environmental category.
Okay, so she also says that environmental costs are avoided now for coal ash landfill projects that will not be needed in the future. Why wouldn't avoided environmental costs be included today for landfill costs projected to be avoided in the future?
And this is another point of disagreement between myself and Ms. Glick, where she is looking at a projection that we had done a while back, saying that we might need new landfill at a couple of the facilities, additional on-site landfills to be constructed at the Marshall and at the Cliffside plants in, I think, 2023 and 2025, respectively. And to include a avoided capital cost associated with those today for net energy metering, in my estimation, my testimony would be premature and inappropriate, given all the changes we're seeing happening in terms of coal and the consumption of coal dropping and continuing to drop. There's a possibility those landfills may or may not be needed in that time frame, certainly not that soon. We're doing things like installing the ability to fire natural gas at those units. And so to the extent natural gas prices stay low, that would further reduce our need to burn coal and push out the need for these coal ash or these landfills. So to insert a benefit today for NEM resources, avoiding those, and I think Ms. Glick had it at 2/1,000ths of a cent per kilowatt hour, which is effectively pretty close to zero, could actually be zero when you take into account the fact that those coal ash landfills may get pushed out in time if needed at all.
Thank you. Commissioners, any other questions? Commissioner Williams?
Nothing, Mr. Chairman.
Okay. Be light on. Okay, Mr. Ellaby. Thank you. All right. Okay, thank you. You may step down. Okay, we're going to take about a 10-minute break and then we will reconvene.